I'm Daisy.
And I'm Terri.
And this is the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 109. Well, we are back as promised with the last episode, not the last episode talking about something from Brené Brown, I am very sure, but the last episode talking about her book, Atlas of the Heart. So this is a wrapping up, and actually I've taken notes from the last chapter, which is entitled Cultivating Meaningful Connection, and this is where everything comes together. So are you ready, Terri?
I am ready, and I did not take notes, so I'm going to field what you say. I did listen to the chapter several times, so not unfamiliar with it, but I'm going to rely on your notes today, Daisy.
Let's do it. So she talked a bit about theory and what it means and how she comes up with her theories, but I put a big cross through that because I'm desperately trying to reduce my 7 pages of notes down to something that's reasonable. So we'll jump straight into cultivating meaning connection, and the key concept is this concept that we've spoken about before of near enemies. I can't remember which episode, but she introduces it quite early on in the book, and it really comes to the fore in this final chapter. Very, very important. And it's basically this idea. She's quoting someone called Chris Germer here. Near enemies are states that appear similar to the desired quality, but actually undermine it. Far enemies are easy to recognize. They're the opposite of what we're trying to achieve. But near enemies are rather sneaky, but they do undermine connection. And when we're talking about cultivating meaning connection, you can see why they're a big problem.
I think she first talked about this in this book in, I don't know what chapter it was, but an example when she was talking about compassion.
That's right.
Or something like that.
Yeah.
And the near enemy was pity. So you look like you are connecting and empathizing with the person, but really it's a distance from I'm better than, looking down on. I think that was the first time I remember hearing that concept.
Yes, you're right. And it's damaging for both parties.
Mm-hmm.
So she goes on to talk a little bit more about connection and her definition, and talking about near enemies. On the surface, she says, near enemies of emotions might look or even feel like connection, but ultimately they drive us to be disconnected from ourselves and each other. Without awareness, near enemies become the practices that fuel separation rather than practices that reinforce the inextricable connection of all people. And she goes on to talk about some different examples which really illustrate the point. But let's go on to meaningful connections. And as I said before, far enemies are really not the thing that gets in the way, because we see them coming. It's the near enemies, this concept of near enemies, that's more important because they're so sneaky. And the problem is that she discusses, we often internalize the pain that comes from near enemies and think that something is wrong with us. Near enemies can feel like manipulation and even gaslighting, she says. So you can tell. Not very nice to be on the receiving end. So this theory of hers that she's been developing on cultivating meaningful connection, it's a theory that has 3 major categories. She says it's a daring and vulnerable practice that requires, number 1, grounded confidence. Number 2, the courage to walk alongside others. And number 3, story stewardship. And And all of these have far enemies and near enemies. And as she discusses these, it really helps you understand these three different categories. And the first one, grounded confidence, this is a key concept that she first came up with in her book, Dare to Lead. And she says that it's not fear that gets in the way of courage, it's armour. And she talks about these different armouring behaviours and how they keep us from showing up in ways that align with our values. And as we recognise and remove the armour, we replace it with grounded confidence. The key component to grounded confidence is that it's a type of confidence driven by a commitment to learning and improving. And this is where she gets into the near enemies. Near enemy of learning and improving is knowing and proving. You can mistake this for confidence, but they're actually a function of low self-worth. The far enemy, she says, is fragile. Self-worth drives us to self-protect at all costs. But the near enemy of learning and improving is knowing and proving.
And I think we see examples of this. Social media is ripe with this. You know, people jump in on other people's posts to correct them, explain how it is, you know.
Be the one, who knows, and then go on to try and prove it.
Yeah.
I am the all-knowing superpower. So she says there are skill sets to developing grounded confidence, and where she started way back when with just a few, she's now added a lot to that. So knowing and applying the language of human emotions and experience, practicing courage, knowing how to rumble with vulnerability, staying curious, practicing humility. And she jumps in here with an example of a near enemy. The near enemy of practicing humility is modesty and insecurity. And the far enemy is hustling and hubris. And this was a chapter that we missed out on. It's a short chapter, a fun chapter, one of those ones where you recognize somebody absolutely when you're listening to it. But she goes into humility and hubris. It's a good one to listen to. Anyway, that's an aside. Feeling embodied and connected with self. And she dives into this idea of embodiment a bit more, and the need to be emotionally aware, and the importance of learning and being curious about ourselves. She quotes somebody called Prentice Hemp Hill, who talks about embodiment as being the awareness of our body's sensations, habits, and beliefs that inform them. Embodiment requires the ability to feel and allow the body's sensations. This embodiment awareness is necessary to realign what we do with what we believe. And conversely, disembodiment is an unawareness, repression, or denial of our sensations and emotions, and or privileging our thinking over our feeling. She goes on to talk about this real importance of learning how to listen to our bodies. A nice quote from her where she says, our bodies are our teachers and messengers to what we are absorbing and becoming. And we need to learn how to listen to our bodies. And grounded confidence requires us to be embodied. And there were lots of other things with that, but I'm trying to get through my notes. But the second one is practicing the courage to walk alongside. And now when she first mentioned this, I was curious as to what this might mean. I'd heard her talk a bit before about grounded confidence, and it's kind of almost self-explanatory, I guess, but practicing the courage to walk alongside. The question that comes up with this is, what does it mean to be other-focused? And how do we use language in service of connection and compassion and be empathetic and non-judgmental. This is all about working with people, not pushing them from behind or trying to lead them from the front, but walking with them in solidarity. And again, near enemies, far enemies. The near enemy of walking alongside is controlling the path. The far enemy, again, obvious, walking away from. But the near enemy, not so obvious, controlling the path. Now, the difference here, she mentioned this being other focused. Walking alongside is other focused. Controlling the path is self-focused.
And I think that can be really hard to detect. And you may be ready to share this example, but something she talked about is, let's say, for example, her kid gets in trouble at school for talking while the teacher's talking. And she listens to the story. And instead of, how do you feel about that? And what do you think is the next step? Instead, she's thinking about, how does this teacher feel about my kid? How does this teacher feel about me? And so you say, or she would say, well, you need to get on and email that teacher right now and apologize and make it right. And I think, especially in an example that she chooses, if you are in a little bit of a leadership role with that other person, a parent, a coach, a therapist, whatever, really hard to distinguish, am I doing this really alongside to help, or am I doing this to control? And I think many of us might justify, but it's okay to control in this situation because I know what needs to happen and this kid doesn't.
I know best.
Yes. Self-righteousness.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. And that's the key. She says it looks like with, but they're generally either try to control us or the outcome. And she quotes somebody called Anna Mott, who said, help is the sunny side of control. And she gets into discussion about power, but we won't get into that. That really comes in when she's talking about social justice and injustice, of course. But the main question here, and you basically said that, is whose best interests are you protecting? So that's what to ask yourself, to really rule out whether you're trying to control the path or whether you truly are walking alongside. And then the third part, again, which I didn't know, I was very curious as to what this was going to be, was story stewardship. And this is quite interesting. She says that for over 2 decades, she has felt that we need to understand emotions so that we can recognize it in ourselves and others. And now she doesn't think that we can recognize emotion in other people, regardless of how much we understand human emotion and experience and how much language we have. I thought this was quite interesting. But why? And she says that too many emotions and experiences present the same way. Where are someone's tears coming from, for example? Is it because they're feeling hopelessness, despair, sadness, resentment? You don't know just from the fact that tears are running down their face. And although there are some universal facial expressions for a small number of emotions, how we express what we're feeling and experiencing can be as unique as we are. And that's where judgment often comes in, I think, when people will judge others because they're not expressing what they think this other person should be feeling in what they feel is an appropriate way. So, somebody who starts laughing, for example, in that situation where you quote unquote should be feeling sad or you should be grieving in some way. But, these sometimes weird emotions bubble up and out, don't they? That can feel quite shocking, but everybody has different facial expressions and the way we're expressing what we're feeling and experiencing. And again, you don't know what's behind it.
I have to share something that it was just kind of weird for me. The other day I started listening to a new book, And then afterward, after the first chapter or so later, I listened to this chapter. And the connection was, I think, pretty significant. This book is called How Emotions Are Made, The Secret Life of the Brain by Lisa Feldman Barrett. And the whole beginning of the book is about this idea that we think emotions can just be read. Like, I know from your facial expression. And they have tested this, and they've done lots of experiments with giving someone a picture of someone, and they'll use kind of emotion terms that are very popular in the US and then show it to someone in Papua New Guinea, and they come up with the right answers. And so they thought they were really proving this theory, going back to Brené Brown's early part of this chapter about how we research things. But what they found is, depending on how they were gathering the data, they got different information. So they could show someone's facial expression, let's say, making a certain facial expression while they're holding a baby. And the story is that the baby's diaper is full, and that facial expression is actually disgust, or
context is key.
But when someone's looking at it, they naturally assume that if they don't see the baby in the picture, they assume that facial expression was anger. So people are interpreting other people's emotions based on the facial expression, but missing out on the context, or basing it on the context and missing out on the intricate details. So we can't know people's emotions as much as we once thought we could just by watching facial expressions. We don't recognize them as easily as some science has shown in the past.
Oh, really interesting. So the natural question then is, so how do we know what people are feeling? Well, it's a very easy answer. We ask them. And then when we ask them, we can engage grounded confidence and the courage to walk alongside. So basically we ask them, but then, this is where it starts getting important, but then we listen and we become trusted stewards of their stories. So what does this story stewardship mean? Brené Brown defines it as honouring the sacred nature of storytelling, both the ones we share and the ones we hear, and knowing that we've been entrusted with something valuable. We treat them with respect and care if sharing with others. This is an aside, just like you just illustrated. You read something or something crosses your path that seems very relevant. And I saw a post on Facebook where they posted a meme and said, "Do you agree?" And the quote was, "When a person tells you you hurt them, you don't get to decide you didn't." And the interesting part of this was that I scrolled down and looked at the comments. And very quickly into those comments, people were getting defensive, and they were starting to insert themselves and to insert what they believed. They started, sharing examples of how, this isn't always true and can't always be true. It was fascinating. Really, really interesting. So I had, all of Brené Brown's theories going round in my mind as I was looking at it, how you can take a fairly simple statement and start putting all sorts of things into it that aren't actually there. So what's the near enemy of story stewardship? Performing connection while driving disconnection. And this is acting interested or invested, but there's more going on under the surface that's driving disconnection and separation. But as I was listening to this, it was a little bit like the self-righteousness episode. It was, oh, dearie, dearie me, I recognize myself in this. What are the problems that crop up? Well, we're talking about advice giving, problem solving, being the knower. What we need to say is something along the lines of, thank you for sharing this with me. What does support look like to you? What do you need? You tell me. And she mentions all the way through an accompanying PDF. And I don't always look at the accompanying PDF, but she describes it in such interesting ways, and a lot of energy and creativity has gone into this PDF. So I did go and look at it afterwards, and there are some really good bits and pieces that the accompanying PDF crops up all the way through the book. But there's a great example of putting this theory of cultivating meaningful connection into practice, and really makes it very clear. The biggest threats to story stewardship are the two near enemies of building narrative trust. And building narrative trust is acknowledging, affirming, and believing. But the two near enemies are narrative takeover and narrative tap out. Narrative takeover is when we make it about us or our perception of what happened. Narrative tap out is anything from subtle disinterest to complete shutdown. She does say that sometimes if the reason for narrative tap out, if that's what you're feeling, is that you can't take it on right now, it's much better to say that than to diminish someone's story.
Talking about recognizing it for your own experience, for me, these were so significant because when I'm sharing my story or my experience and someone just jumps right into advice giving or problem solving, I instantly shut down. And then the narrative takeover. I dated someone many, many years ago, and every time I would express something that I was experiencing and maybe was upset, they would take it over by, oh, I know exactly what you mean. When this happened to me, this, blah, 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 blah. And suddenly they've been talking for 5 minutes. One of my defense mechanisms is I just shut down. I just stop talking. I stop engaging. And this happened so many times that for me, the connection was over. I didn't want to share anything anymore because everything got taken over, made about them. Never felt heard. So when I looked at this chart and when I heard this, I'm like, yes, this is for sure one of the easiest ways to disconnect from me is to do these things.
Yeah. When you're trying to cultivate meaningful connection. Yeah. But she says, interestingly, we can tap out of sharing our own stories too. This is often because of a lack of grounded confidence or self-trust about when and how to share them. Tapping out feels like betrayal. Either somebody else is betraying us or we're betraying ourselves. And obviously, that's not a very nice feeling to have, I should imagine.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it is going to bring up things like resentment, isn't it? But yes, narrative takeover. When we hijack the story and center ourselves. It can look like shifting the focus to ourselves or questioning or not believing the story that somebody's telling you because it's different from our lived experience.
Or even our interpretation.
Yeah.
I know I do this still at times, and I know I did it a lot as a therapist. I would hear someone tell their story and I'd say, really? Do you think that's really what she was thinking of you? Because I hear this. And it's like, oh my gosh, Terri. Now when I reflect on that, it's like, oh, that wasn't the first place to go with this response.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it? But basically, by doing that, you're rejecting the truth of somebody's story. And this, by the way, she says, is the ultimate failure of story stewardship. We stealthily center ourselves in their story, and the narrative takeover is about protecting our own egos, behavior, or privilege. And the perfect example of narrative takeover is commenting all lives matter on a Black Lives Matter post. We've all seen that over and over again. Story stewardship, she says, is not, and she has talked about this before, but it's not walking in somebody else's shoes. It's being curious and building narrative trust as they tell you about the experience of being in their own shoes. It's about believing people when they tell you what an experience meant to them. But yes, it's definitely something I struggle with. I think you can be very well-intentioned with narrative takeover, especially if it comes from a sort of problem-solving, advice-giving. I think there's also sometimes that need to prove is probably an appropriate word to use here, but prove that you understand what they're saying by sharing an example of how you felt. But of course, you're centering yourself. So stop doing it. Daisy, stop it. But lastly, she just goes on to talk about the importance of language. It's always about language and how this is core to all three. And the near enemy of knowing and applying language is shaping emotion and experience to fit what we know. We take nuanced emotions and experiences and force them into the language we have. We touched on this a little bit with when we were talking about anger. But the result of this is that we are less capable of sharing what we are experiencing, getting help, or moving through our experiences productively. And it's a near enemy because we may be talking about or sharing our feelings, but we can't get to healing because we're limited by our language. It says that our connection with others can only be as deep as our connection with ourselves. And I think it's important that she starts these three things she lists with this grounded confidence. So, this chapter was really about pulling everything together and the theory of cultivating meaningful connection and how it's key to everything. But I guess cultivating meaningful connection with ourselves as well as with other people. Certainly my biggest takeaway is, and I have become much more aware of it, is guarding against narrative takeover. I definitely have a tendency, more than a tendency, of heading towards this, wanting to jump in and to help, to problem solve, to, offer a positive perspective, whatever it is. I accept that it's well intentioned, but it's often just not often, just not the right thing to do.
It reminds me of something that I don't even know where I learned this, whether from my own therapist or from group training or something. But for me, I'm recognizing as you were talking about it, for me, often what gets triggered is impatience. Mm. And so when I come in and want to hurry and get there, it's like, okay, I care about your story, but let's wrap it up and solve it. So I need to be more aware of my impatience. And then the piece that I learned that it's okay to ask someone what they actually need. And I'm quick to want to jump in and tell you, well, here's how to take care of that, or here's what it actually means, versus, like you said earlier, thank you for sharing that with me. That sounds complicated. What would you need from me right now? Do you want to do some problem solving? Do you want to hear my take on it? Like what would be helpful to you? Because I want to jump in and just tell them what I think and tell them how to fix it, versus that may not be at all what they're looking for. And so that idea of, and in the reverse, to ask for what you need when you tell someone your story. Like to be able to say, I want to tell you what happened today, and I don't want you to fix it for me. I don't want any solutions offered. I just want you to hear me. All right, I can just listen then and make sure you know that I heard you. But I think that's an important piece on both sides of a relationship.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually.
To be able to ask for what you need from sharing, and to be able to check in with the other, what do they need from you based on their sharing?
Yeah, because I think so often we sort of get affirmation that we're doing the right thing. I did it this morning. I was having a conversation with somebody, and he was talking about a new job that he'd applied for and didn't know what to do because it was the other side of London, and it was going to be either a long commute or it'd have to move, didn't want to move away from this area, and I suggested maybe thinking about, would he be able to use that commute as a way of doing all the admin? So instead of having to bring admin home, it could be done on the train. And he was, I think I love you. I hadn't thought of that. That's a great way to... So that's just affirmed me jumping in and solving your problem for you. So sometimes it is the right thing to do, but like you just said, asking what somebody needs and maybe putting it as a suggestion. I'd be happy to give you my perspective, but is that something that you would find helpful? And if they say no, keep it to your damn self.
Because sometimes people will ask me, do you want to know what I would do? And sometimes I might say, right now, no, I don't. Yeah. I just need you to hear me. And I just needed to say this. And maybe later I'll want your opinion or your example or something. But to me, I think that's an important dynamic that helps in these situations, to ask someone what they need and to practice asking for what you need.
Yeah, I mean, you can even be upfront about it. I've got some great ideas about, a different perspective on your problem, but do you want to hear it? Start with that if it's too difficult not to just jump in. But yes, I think you could see it's a big problem with me, and I'm sure you know it because I know I've done it to you. I do it to everybody. I can't help myself, but I need to learn to help myself. That's the point. So I think that's probably my biggest takeaway from Atlas of the Heart. Because meaningful connections are important, right? So if I'm hampering that myself, I need to stop.
Absolutely.
So what's your biggest takeaway?
I think in some way, this is so self-focused, but it is about me learning how to do this better. It's about slowing myself down, almost like applying the brake a little bit. Don't go too quickly into what I think, what I want out of the situation. And remember that even in listening, I'm there as the navigator in the passenger seat rather than the driver's seat. Get out of the driver's seat when it's someone else's story.
Oh, I like that.
Not hold back too much. Like, don't disengage. Be willing to engage, but to hold back a little bit on rushing in, I think, is the biggest takeaway for me. Somehow slowing myself down to think about how it's being received and felt by the other person.
Because I guess it must be a big problem with you that people, more often than not, probably do come to you for advice. They want to know what you think. That must be pretty common.
But they need to be heard in that process.
Yeah.
So obviously, this is another great chapter in this book, and I'm guessing will be a whole nother book at some point of really helping people to use this theory. But I'm hoping that people have enjoyed listening to the various chapters that we've covered, and then this kind of way of pulling it together and using this emotion and experience description and clarification to help us in our process of cultivating meaningful connections. So I hope that I do this for you. I hope that I'm a good steward of your stories and that I walk alongside of you in our friendship, Daisy.
You do.
And I hope that everyone is able to take some from today's sharing and think about themselves in this process. How can we do this better? So everybody, have a great week. Daisy, have a great week. And we'll be back soon.
You too, Terri. Thank you. Have a wonderful week.